against what I call the net zero madness. And that's why I want to have a section, hopefully every week, certainly every fortnight, a climate sanity section to really debate all of the various issues around it, because we hear so much catastrophizing, and in some sense you're almost not allowed to debate some of this stuff. It's much more vitriolic than Brexit. Again, it makes Brexit look like a walk in the park. I tried to organise a small rally up in Bolton. Well, I mean, the intimidation and the threats to the venue owner was one thing. And one of the concerns constantly raised is the melting ice caps and the sea level rising, and we're all going to be swamped and islands are going to disappear. And that's why I was fascinated to read an article recently by Joakim Book entitled "Are Low-Lying Islands Helpless in the Face of Sea Level Rise?" And Joakim is a research fellow at the American Institute of Economic Research and is with me now on Zoom this morning on Tice Talk. Joakim, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. So, lots of climate catastrophizing by so many people. It was only recently a lady was in tears. She was so anxious in an interview on Talk TV, and you've got people like the esteemed Washington Post editorial warning back in 2019 that there would be 6.5 feet increase in sea levels by 2100 that would swamp as much territory as the whole of Western Europe and make 187 million people homeless. So we should all be terrified and deeply concerned. Is that right?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me on the show, Richard, and good morning to all of you. Yeah, this is a concern that comes up all the time. And people don't really look into it, and they don't really concern themselves with it. They just look at the figures. They see hundreds of millions of climate refugees and they go pretty crazy. We have all these surveys of kids in the UK being terrified out of their wits for, the things that may happen from climate change. And I think it's, like you mentioned, it's important to have a sanity check on this. I've called for a sensible environmentalism for a couple of years and have a more sane approach to this.
That's right, because the reality of that Washington Post forecast, which is the equivalent of about 6.5 feet in 80 years, you put in your article, the reality is about 1/10 of that is what's really happening. Why does that never appear in the Washington Post or the New York Times?
Yeah, I guess it doesn't produce as many clicks or sell as many newspapers. I don't know. But the thing is that really bothers me is that you can look at they're referring to a real scientific journal article, and you can look at the article and see what they did. And what most articles do and most serious climate researchers do is that they sort of abstract away from what's known as adaptation, right? It's very hard to know exactly how societies are going to respond to some kind of change in nature. So you basically just ignore it and you say, okay, let's imagine everyone stays where they are. Everybody lives where they are. We don't upgrade any infrastructure. We don't do anything at all. And then we add 100 years worth of sea level rises to that. What's going to happen? And then you get these maps of half of London is flooded, or half of Vietnam, all these maps where certain areas, massive areas are going to be flooded, and small islands in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean are going to disappear.
And this idea that people are just going to sort of sit on their island and wait for sea level to rise and slowly tragically drown is, of course, utter nonsense. And I mean, Netherlands is a pretty good example of how to deal and how to adapt and how to react, isn't it?
Yeah, Netherlands is my favorite example. It's something like a third of the country is below the sea level. Schiphol at Amsterdam International Airport, one of the busiest airports in Europe, is 4 meters below sea level.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Is it flooded? Do we swim? Do we land on water? No, we don't. We have engineering infrastructure to fix this.
There we are. Exactly. And so here's the other thing that I was fascinated in your article that you wrote on human progress, where you were saying that actually some of the islands that have been highlighted that have been most at risk are actually seeing an increase in their landmass as opposed to being swamped by the sea.
Yeah, I thought this was so. This fear comes up a lot, especially whenever there's a climate summit coming around or the Guardian wants to run something. It's always like small islands in the Pacific that are going to be completely swamped by sea level rise, and it sort of makes sense. They're small islands. They're very low laying. They're very shallow, and so it sort of makes sense that a rising sea will eventually consume them entirely. So I thought I would have a look. Like, we've had rising sea levels for about for hundreds of years. And they've been increasing a tiny bit in recent decades. So certainly some of these islands should have disappeared a bit already, right? Which they should have lost landmass. So we look, and the researchers who studied this find that no, most of these islands have grown in size, partly because of sediment and partly because they're actually building out these islands. Like the Maldives is a perfect example that I brought up in the article. They started in the 90s. They started building a new island next to their capital city because they wanted more space. And now it's the size of London.
Wow.
And this is always this sort of island that's going to be swamped by climate change. But they built a new one with sand and following the lead of the Dutch, basically.
So they've been doing that funny thing called using their brains, adapting and reacting, which is, of course, that's human intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But that's also very hard to project or forecast in an academic article. So basically what researchers do is say, well, let's assume that nothing happens. What is the raw impact of nature from a changing climate? And then, they get these like projections like, oh yeah, 187 million climate refugees. And of course, like the headlines in the newspaper isn't, if we do nothing, there's going to be a problem. It's 100
That's right.
million.
Whilst you've been talking, Joakim, Pablo has messaged in, there's been sea level rise of give or take 3 millimeters over the last 100+ years. What's happening is that land has been rising and sinking since the last ice age. Is he right?
Yeah. So this is also something that people keep forgetting. They think of everything as one story. It depends a lot where you are in the world. Some areas of the world are from melting glaciers and stuff, like particularly in Greenland, southern Alaska, Iceland, places like that, where the weight of the glaciers is reduced and the land is actually rising. So they have a lot of those places have the opposite problem, where the sea level is basically retracting because the land is rising. So I mean, you can't look at this as like one story where everything happens the same everywhere. Like it depends where you are to some extent.
Sure. I was also struck by one of the clauses in the latest IPCC sixth report on. I'm one of those sad people that's actually read a chunk of it, and I got to page 41. I got to page 41, clause D 1.6. If anybody wants to, you just got to read this, because it actually said that even if we went to negative net zero, just think about that. If we went to negative net zero, which is what lots of people are heading towards, want us to go towards, with all the cost and impoverishment that would involve, there'd be no change to sea level rise for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So one of the greatest concerns about climate change is the impact on the sea level rises. But even if we did what they want us to do, it wouldn't make any difference for hundreds of years. So surely would it be much better, as you say, adapting and spending money on infrastructure?
Yeah, and I think if you ask climate scientists this honest question, like most of them agree that a lot of the impacts that we are foreseeing are already baked into the system. There's very little that we can do right now to prevent some of the climate change effects over the next century. So we're still going to end up in a scenario where we have to do adaptation. And then, we might as well focus on that.
Joakim, we can't please everybody. We've had a message in here says, get people who understand the climate to talk about climate change, not more nutters and deniers. There we go. We're not in denial of it. That's the whole point.
We're not.
We're saying that it's happened forever. The deniers are the people that think this is a recent thing, isn't it?
We actually read the IPCC reports and see what the actual science says. And most of the time, it's not the stories that we see on the flashed across the headlines and the apocalyptic crazy stuff that we see from left to right. Like, climate science is a lot more serious than what it seems from the front page of New York Times.
I think that's right. We're saying, yes, there's climate change. There's always been climate change. There always will be. It's about how you react, how you adapt, how you use common sense.
Yeah, so this is a really crucial point that I try to make all the time. We're a lot more protected from nature today than we have ever been, partly because we're richer and partly because we have the technology to protect ourselves against it. So even like to the extent that climate change will harm our societies and change our societies, we're in a much better position to safeguard ourselves against that.
Yeah, fantastic. Joakim, thank you so much for coming on my show and for sharing those thoughts with me. A fascinating article you wrote on human progress. I look forward to speaking to you again soon on this section that I'm going to be having regularly on my Tice Talk show called Climate Sanity.